Well, good morning, everyone. Back in June, when the city adopted its balanced budget for the current fiscal year, which, let me remind you, started on July 1st and will finish this coming June 30th, we sounded a note of caution. We projected at that time, based on the information we had then, revenues and expenses for the fiscal year would be out of balance by roughly $2 billion. That's for the fiscal year 2014, which will finish up in June. Today, I am happy to report in our November modification to the budget, which is required by city law, that we believe we have closed that gap. And the result is that for the first time in modern memory, and perhaps for the first time in New York City history, the budget for an incoming fiscal year has been balanced for an incoming mayor well before he or she stepped into office. Let me add that we have done that without proposing any tax increases or cuts in essential services. After the election, we did promise, if you remember a month ago, a world-class transition from our administration to that of Mayor-elect de Blasio. And today, by presenting this balanced budget for a fiscal year that begins more than 7 months from now, we're taking a major step, we think, towards making good on that commitment. This historic accomplishment results from New York's continued economic growth, from our administration's fiscal discipline, and from the significant savings which we've achieved in recent months. And let me briefly sketch some of the principal factors allowing us to present this balanced budget for fiscal 2015, starting with the city's improved revenue picture. Now, let me remind you, fiscal 2015 starts next July 1st. First, because of the strength of New York City's economy, tax revenues, primarily from personal income and real estate transaction taxes in the current fiscal year, that is 2014, are running about $500 million ahead of the levels that we forecast back in the spring. Let me remind you that that is a fact up through now. Projections into the future obviously have some variability in them. I don't know whether the economy or the stock market are going to continue to grow any more than anybody else does. But clearly, it is a little bit better than what we forecast back then. And so $500 million out of the $2 billion budget gap is closed by increased revenues, or revenues that we believe will be there. Income from investments by the city's pension system is also running ahead of projections and easing the strain on the city budget. I think it's fair to say there is nobody that had predicted that the S&P would be up 25% this calendar year alone and 19% or whatever it was last year. But that certainly helps the pension funds. And to the extent that they have better returns, it gives us the ability to, or relieves us of the obligation to send those extra monies to the pension funds. We will realize more than $200 million from the sale of 2 underutilized city-owned buildings here in Lower Manhattan. And we're expecting $60 million from Verizon as repayment for delays in upgrading the city's 911 system, which I'm happy to report is working very well. It just was delivered late, and Verizon had a contract, and we're holding them to that contract, and so we'll get an unexpected $60 million from that. And in line with what has been widely reported, proceeds from the sales of the new taxi medallions are also $56 million above what we had booked them, expected them to be, although I will say all along we believe that the changes that we've made in the taxi business are good for the consumers and also good for the owners, and that is reflected in the higher price for the medallions. Receipts from medallion sales in the spring and in fiscal 2015 are likely to exceed our earlier expectations as well, and all of these added revenues help us balance the budget for the next fiscal year. We're also balancing next year's budget with savings produced by steps we've taken to streamline city government operations. And that is really the biggest chunk of the monies that will reduce the deficit. We've taken steps that we think will result in recurring savings for many years to come. That's our responsibility to find ways to do that, and we've been working very hard for 12 years, and a lot of the things that we've been working on for a long period of time are now coming to fruition. We are, for example, expecting savings of some $364 million in fiscal 2015 because we have, for the first time, proposed competitive bidding in selecting the primary health insurance provider for city employees and retirees. And even though the municipal unions have attempted to delay this process, the result is that the current provider is not, for the first time in 15 years, seeking an increase in premium rates. And that's not only saving taxpayers money in the next fiscal year, it will produce even bigger savings in the years after that. Our reform of motorized fleet operations, which many of you were at a garage where we announced this, have already reduced city agency expenses by some $240 million, and those savings will grow to more than $415 million by fiscal 2016 and produce something like $45 million in annual recurring savings after that. The sale of city-owned office buildings that I mentioned earlier is part of a larger consolidation of city office space that will cut rent and operating costs by some $470 million over the next 20 years. And the school bus contracts that we've awarded this year, the first competitively bid contracts in more than 30 years, will save taxpayers some $210 million over the next 5 fiscal years alone. Let me point out that this budget also maintains a reserve fund to settle all expired municipal union contracts, funding reasonable raises going forward. In fact, for some unions, the raises could start immediately. As part of such settlements, employees would have to agree to make reasonable contributions to the cost of their health care. There's nothing different from what we've been saying all along. Right now, more than 90% of city employees pay zero towards their health care premiums. Taxpayers cover the entire cost, and that contrasts sharply with the practice of state employees who typically pay a substantial share of their health care premiums. Before taking questions, I would like to thank Deputy Mayor for Operations Kaz Holloway and his team for their work on the health insurance reforms and the fleet and office space consolidations that contributed significantly to our ability to present a balanced budget for fiscal 2015. And I'd also like to thank Budget Director Mark Page and his team at the Office of Management and Budget for the tremendous job they've done not only today but for the past 12 years. With their help, we've balanced the books for the next administration well before it comes into office. And we've actually done a lot more than that, if you think about it. The decisions we've made over the past 12 years have helped put New York's economy on a sound footing going forward. Our city has the highest level of private sector employment ever, and we're on course to set another record year in tourism as well. We've also modernized and streamlined many basic city operations in ways that will serve the next administration well. And over the years, we've also saved money by reducing headcount. In fact, I don't think any administration, certainly not in modern memory, has reduced headcount as much as we did, and that was with one exception. That was during the Beam administration in the 1970s, and back then the city was forced to undergo massive layoffs and make deep cuts in services and investments. Over the last 12 years, by contrast, we've expanded services and investments even as we've reduced headcounts, and almost all of it was done by attrition. We talked about doing more with less, and I think it's fair to say that we did. During our tenure in office, we were hit by 2 of the biggest financial calamities in the city's history, the post-9/11 recession and the worldwide financial crisis and recession of 2008. We led the city through both calmly and steadily, and the city came through stronger each time. We've achieved an unprecedented level of fiscal stability and certainty, and we're now handing over a balanced budget for the first time in the city's modern history. We're proud of what we've achieved, and now we want to help the de Blasio administration do even better, and a balanced budget for fiscal 2015 will certainly help them get off to the best possible start. I'd be happy to take some questions.